President, please be seated. The chamber is now back in session, and I give the floor to the International Deputy Co-Prosecutor to continue putting questions to the witness.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before I continue, I'd like to make sure, in terms of time, since we started at 9:30, so I'd like to know if it would be possible for us to continue until 9:30 tomorrow morning. And if that is the case, I will continue putting questions today, and the civil party lawyers will pick up tomorrow morning for 30 minutes. Well, that's it. Witness, we were discussing the structure of S21, and I had one or two questions left regarding that. Did you ever hear of the names of two people coming from office S71? And the names were Pang, P-A-N-G, and Lin, L-I-N.
No, I never heard of these names.
Au niveau de...
And at S21, was there also a messenger unit working with the head of the prison, Doik?
There was a messenger unit who accompanied Duc from Om Liang.
Est-ce que vous savez...
Do you know if this messenger unit was in charge of transmitting envelopes and therefore messages to party authorities?
The messenger was in charge of delivering letters to the upper level and from the upper level to the lower level.
And earlier you spoke about reports that were sent by Doik to brothers number 1 and 2. Who were the messengers at S21 who were in charge of delivering these reports? Do you know their names, or at least the names of some of them?
I did not know the names of the messengers. I just knew that there were messengers.
À S21, est-ce que...
Were sometimes entire families arrested at S21? Did you sometimes see entire families, husband, wife, and children, arrive at S21?
I saw staff who work at S21, the person by the name Heng and his wife is Ri. They were all imprisoned.
En dehors du personnel de S21,
aside from the S21 staff, did you see women coming from other places, let us say from the zones, from the ministries, or from the divisions, either because they were with their husbands or because they had been arrested as enemies?
Je n'ai pas reçu la traduction.
I did not hear the interpretation. I heard Ming in Khmer, but I did not hear the French interpretation.
Est-ce que vous pourriez répéter votre réponse?
Can you please repeat your answer, witness, regarding women?
Yes, there were cases where prisoners were arrested and brought in along with their husbands and wives and children.
Concernant les...
Now, regarding children, did Duke tell you ever in training sessions why children were also arrested?
Dans quel but?
And for what purpose?
I do not know the details regarding this matter. I only saw that the prisoners were brought in along with their spouse and children.
Est-ce que vous avez...
Were you ever asked to interrogate children?
No, never.
Est-ce qu'à l'époque...
And did you know the expression removing all roots back then? Does that mean anything to you?
Yes, I heard that phrase, removing the grass. We needed to remove its roots. When we arrested the enemy, we had to arrest everyone in that network from the higher up to the low, down to the lower level.
Est-ce que parmi les personnes appartenant...
And among the people who belong to the enemy networks, were the spouses and children also included?
I understood that anyone related to the enemy would be arrested, whether those people who were related to the enemy were spouse or children.
Concernant les femmes, est-ce...
Now, regarding the women, did you sometimes interrogate any? Did your superiors ask you, or did your superiors assign one or two women with you to interrogate women?
Yes, I used to.
Est-il correct?
Is it true that at S21 there were relatively few women who were interrogated in relation to men?
Yes, that is correct.
J'ai entendu Baba, je n'ai pas entendu...
I heard Baba, I didn't hear the translation, so I imagine it means yes, yes, so yes. So it was a small technical glitch here, Mr. President. Did Duke, during the training sessions, tell you that it was also necessary to resort to violence or torture against women if the women did not confess, or when the women did not confess?
talking about torturing, regardless of whether the prisoners were men or female or women. As long as that prisoner refused to confess, we must use torture.
Est-ce que tous les prisonniers
Were all prisoners detained at S21 interrogated? And if not, what was the approximate proportion of people who were interrogated in relation to those who were not?
I do not fully know about the details, but about 50 or 60% of the prisoners were interrogated.
Did you have enough interrogators? Did you have enough time to interrogate the prisoners? Is it the lack of time and staff that explains, or that explains why not everyone was interrogated?
I said that 50 or 60%, because initially we had many interrogators. Later on, interrogators were also arrested and executed, while the number of prisoners increased, but the number of interrogators decreased. I saw prisoners were shackled in the upper floor of the building. 10 or 15 of them were shackled together, and I did not see those prisoners brought for interrogation.
Donc vous nous dites qu'à un moment donné, il y a
So you're telling us that at one point in time there were fewer interrogators than prisoners, many fewer. Therefore, did you receive any orders to accelerate the cadence in obtaining confessions? And in particular, were you asked to change interrogation techniques to be more efficient, to go faster?
The methods were to expedite the interrogation process were instructed to us, but in reality we could not do this, because in some cases, for example, one prisoner in interrogation of one prisoner took up to 2 months. And we had to do many tasks, including we had to type the confession by ourselves. So it slowed the process.
Je vais passer à un autre sujet.
I'm going to turn to another topic, and I'll be very quick about this. This will be about the detention conditions of the prisoners in these cells. You spoke about prisoners being shackled to an iron bar. So I'm not going to speak about all of the conditions, because we have already discussed these in detail. In case 001, for example, you spoke about these conditions before the investigating judges, but I still do have a few questions. The prisoners you interrogated, were they thin?
The prisoner whom I interrogated, some of them were thin, some of them had physical injury because they did not receive enough food to eat while they were detained in the prison.
Est-ce que votre travail
Was your work as an interrogator sometimes delayed because the prisoners were ill? Or was your work interrupted because prisoners died of illness in their cells?
Yes, there were such cases happened. Sometimes during the course of the interrogation, the prisoner died. President, the floor is given to Counsel Victor Kope.
I apologize, sorry. No objection, Mr. President, but an observation. An observation as to something the prosecution said three or four questions ago when he started talking about the detention situation. He said, I'm going to be short because we discussed this already in case 001. That might seem like a sort of innocent remark, but I believe it's a very telling remark because we on this side of the courtroom haven't discussed the detention conditions of S21 at all. And I think I would like to be on the record as saying that I find that remark very troublesome, and it is illustrative of what has been going on in this particular segment up until now. The prosecution has a big advantage of having been in this very courtroom in case 001 interviewing this witness. We haven't. And if we are being confronted, or are we continuously getting the idea that we're just doing this case quickly again and move on, I find that very problematic. So I want to have on the record that for the defense, at least for Nguyen Chia, this is the first time that he has the opportunity to challenge the evidence, to hear the witnesses. The prosecution now saying, I have to move on quickly because we already dealt with it, that's fine, but we haven't. And I think it is very important that the chamber should note that that is something we find very difficult to accept.
Mr. President, I would like to respond. Of course, if there are objections or observations, may they please be short, because the defense has been objecting for practically 5 minutes already. We agree, of course. This is very personal. I'm not going to insist upon the detention conditions, but of course the defense is there and will have the opportunity of putting all questions they wish regarding the detention conditions. So I don't see why it was necessary to interrupt my examination at this moment. We understand that the Nguyen Chia defense was not there in the first case, and the Nguyen Chia defense is entitled to put all the questions it wishes regarding the detention conditions at S21. That's absolutely not a problem. Witness, regarding your last answer in which you said that certain prisoners had died in their cells, and you also said that some prisoners had died during the interrogations. Do you know a comrade by the name of Tri, T-R-Y, who was working at the S21 medical unit?
I know Medic 3, he was the chief of the medical unit.
Je voudrais lire un extrait du carnet.
I would like to read out an excerpt of an interrogator's notebook E333. It was only translated into French. It's on page 40, French ERN 00282507, Khmer 3 times 0 777 And therefore there is no English translation, as I said. And this is an excerpt in which a criticism and self-criticism session is described. And I quote, Comrade Tree, TRY therefore, is afraid when enemies die massively. He's afraid of being arrested by Ankar. Right now, he is not in good spirits because too many people are dying. End of quote, free translation. So according to your recollection, were there periods during which there were epidemics or people who would die massively because of illness?
I did not know much about whether prisoners were received epidemic, but there were cases where prisoners died one after another. There were prisoners died every day.
And during the interrogations, did you have the prisoners' biographical details at hand? You said that Susti recorded the prisoners and would draw up their biographies. So did you have these biographies available to you in order to begin the interrogations and to know, for example, what the person was called, how old that person was, where that person lived, and what that person's job was, and how many children that person may have had, and the location as well as the arrest date? Did you have this data available?
When the prisoners were first brought in for interrogation, Tachan gave us the letters including the names, the age, and the provinces the prisoner came from, and he gave this to us.
Est-ce que c'était un bout de papier?
Was this on a sheet of paper, or was this a full page with the title Prisoner's Biography?
It was a brief note about 3 fingers size note, including brief information like the names, the provinces the prisoner came from, and the number of the holding cell of the prisoners.
Merci.
Thank you. Now another question regarding the interrogations. Did you usually interrogate the prisoner's correct interpreter alone?
Normally, when I observed when I just started the interrogation assignment, I was put with one senior or experienced interrogator, but later on, after I became experienced, I did it alone.
Est-il arrivé que votre...
Did your group leader, in particular the last one, Tit, as well as Chan, Hor or Doik, did they ever come into the interrogation room, in your interrogation room, and listen and watch how you would interrogate prisoners.
Yes, the 2 or 3 names you just mentioned, yes, they came to inspect me sometimes because they were in superior position, so they had the right to go into different rooms for inspection.
Est-ce que Tit, votre chef de groupe,
Did Teet, your group leader, as well as Doik, the head of S21, sometimes put questions to the prisoners you were interrogating?
That or do, yes, they came in and they asked the prisoners what their name was, the provinces they came from. Yes, there were occasions when they came in and asked questions.
au début d'un...
Did you put preliminary questions at the beginning of an interrogation in order to understand briefly the prisoner's biography?
Yeah, in the first step, we asked them about their biography, about their relationships. We used the techniques to ask for details answers for a few days until the prisoners gave us the confession, and if the prisoners refuse to confess, and then we seek without permission from Duch and Chan to use torture.
What were the exact objectives of using torture? What was necessary to obtain when a prisoner was tortured?
The objective was to obtain the confession.
Et qui vous a formé?
And who trained you to torture? Who gave you ideas on how to torture?
President, Mr. Witness, please hold on. The floor is given to counsel with the copy.
I object to the word in the question, prosecution, the word torture. I'm not sure if this particular prosecutor was there when I made the same objection. There are various degrees of treatment. It's fine if the witness is using that word, but it's not fine if the prosecution doesn't know the legal distinction between various forms of treatment, torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and other treatment which might not necessarily fit the legal definition.
Counsel, first of all, it struck me that yesterday, after we have made a ruling, you yourself used the word torture frequently, but this is just as an aside. In this case, it would appear that the witness has used the word torture. Now, the prosecution, or you can obviously ask him what he means by torture, but we are not forbidding the witness to use a term. We can ask for clarification. That's very obvious.
I'm not aware that I used the word torture yesterday in relation to very specific treatments during interrogation. I don't think I have. And as I said, I don't have a problem if the Khmer word for torture, the Khmer word or the equivalent of torture is used. But we are here dealing with also a legal distinction, and I think you, Judge Fentz, agreed that the prosecution should refer to this very specific treatment that the witness is talking about and not use the generic term torture.
I'm just pointing out that the situation is different. Yesterday we had a prosecutor who himself summed up something as torture. Today we have a witness who uses the word torture. That's a different issue.
That's correct, but that is because it's my understanding that in Khmer there's only one word. But legally and in English there are different words for different kinds of treatment. There is no such word in Khmer for inhuman and degrading treatment or other lighter forms. So there, as I understand the Khmer language to be, there's a generic word for it. So I don't think there is even another word to distinguish between torture and, on the other hand, inhuman and degrading treatment or other forms of treatment which might not reach that qualification. So obviously I'm not a Khmer language expert, but I think it shouldn't matter which, or that the witness is only using that very specific Khmer word when he indicates a very broad range of treatments.
Then wouldn't be the way to go to ask him this clarification. We are not forbidding a witness to use whatever language they want. We can ask to clarify.
Bien, je vais...
Very well. I'll proceed after this interruption. We are going round in circles because if I were to use another term, supposing that the legal definition of that term would correspond to the one given by the defense yesterday, and I'll be ready to discuss it. Even if I were to use another word, it will be translated in such a manner that the witness will have to understand and will have to respond by using the term torture as well. On the other hand, we have in this chamber legal professionals tasked with applying a definition and a legal characterization of the facts. And I think they should clinch the debate.
Allow me, Mr. President, to give one example. I believe this witness is on record in a film, I think of Riti Pan, where he says that at one point during an interrogation he beats the table really hard, which scared the person confessing. Now, I mean, we are in a court of law, so we have to be very precise about that. Maybe that is something that he considers falling under the generic term torture. A small clap is for him torture, but legally, as you said yourself, it might fall under a different different term. So when we just do not pay any attention to what exactly constitutes torture, what exactly does he mean when he's not factual, then we just are not really ascertaining the truth.
As the President of the Chamber, I'd like to make the following observation. I am pretty sure that during yesterday's proceedings, even Counsel Copper used the word torture during the questioning of the witness. And that happened after the defense rose and spoke about the torture, and later on Judge Vance made an observation on this term. And I also make an observation of the generic definition of the term torture within the Khmer context versus its legal definition. And I do not know which term Counsel Copper used in the English language, but through the Khmer interpretation, it came out as torture in Khmer. So that we will review this matter further. That could be a discrepancy in the use of the language there is in Khmer and English, and for that reason counsels, you should maybe limit yourself to other terms, probably like inhumane and degrading treatment, because the word Tiranakam in Khmer, or generic torture definition, is very common in the Khmer context. For example, when a father disciplined a child, we also use the same word, Tiranakam, and that could not be legally defined as a torture. So the word has been embedded within the behavior and tradition and culture of Cambodia, and this is just my observation, and of course we will review this matter further. And again, the parties, if possible, try to use alternative terms, for example, on the treatment, and try to avoid the use of the term torture, and that would minimize the discrepancy of the definition of that term during a questioning of relevant witnesses. You may continue, Deputy Co-Prosecutor.
Qui vous a formé, monsieur le témoin?
Mr. Witness, who trained you in these interrogation techniques that were violent, involving the use of violence and physical coercion?
Regarding the beating and the violent act, initially there were previous workers there who taught me how to use that. They were Hein, Snoon, etc., who taught us how to use such techniques, and that's how I learned from them.
Est-ce que Deutsch lui-même a suggéré?
Did Deutsch himself suggest interrogation techniques which necessarily involve the use of violence?
Deutsch himself also provided us the training in the political study session on the techniques to mistreat prisoners and not to make it severe so that they died and the confession cut off. And he provided successive trainings on this matter, and the method of waterboarding was also taught by him, how prisoners had to be forced to eat feces and to drink urine. They were all taught by Deutsch.
Est-ce qu'en général les prisonniers
In general terms, did prisoners spontaneously confess, depending on the soft techniques used? Or were there times when you had to use the techniques that Deutsch or other superiors of yours had taught you, and which involved recourse to violence? And did prisoners frequently confess all that they had done without any recourse to violence?
In instances where a non-violent act was applied, prisoners actually confess. Sometimes we had to appeal to the prisoners to confess, and sometimes that was successful. And in other instances, violent act or mistreatment or beating had to be implemented so that the prisoners would confess.
est-ce que la méthode douce
Did the soft method that we knew use psychological pressure or threats deployed against prisoners?
Cold method employed, including making an appeal to a particular prisoner to give them food to eat, and another way is that if they confess, then the party would release them. These are the methods that we used.
Je vais revenir là-dessus, mais avant.
I'll return to that, but before we do so, I want to bring up something you said in E3/5156 on page 14 in French, 9 in English, and 11 in Khmer. This is what you stated, and I quote, free translation. There were 99% of the prisoners who claimed not to have committed any faults after the interrogations. And further down, when they were interrogated, in most cases they said that they were not guilty. However, the confessions we obtained generally showed that they were not innocent. The fact that they had been brought there was proof that they were guilty. Free translation. End of quote. So here you state that in 99% of the cases, the prisoners started by saying that they hadn't committed any faults. Do you have any remark to make regarding this?
I object to this question, Mr. President. The witness can only say something in relation to, I believe, 50 or so interrogations that he was involved in. I don't think he can say anything about interrogations of other prisoners. If the number of 50 is accurate, I'm not quite sure. That's what I read in Isa Osman's account. But asking this witness, to give a generic overview of what all interrogations produced in S21 is going beyond the realm of his knowledge.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I would like to respond. First of all, I didn't talk of 50 interrogations. It was only Isa Osman who said so regarding the objection. The sources of information used by the witness may come from interrogation sessions he conducted himself and training sessions he attended with Deutsch and other superiors. All I'm doing is to quote what he says in the record of interview. I would like him to comment on what he said at the time, essentially that there were 99% of the prisoners who said they hadn't committed any faults after the initial interrogations. May I ask the witness to respond to this question, Mr. President?
The objection by the defense counsel for Nguyen Chia, Counsel Copper, is overruled. The question is proper so that it can be put to the witness, and the chamber would also like to hear a response from this witness. Answer. To respond to the last question about the 99% of those prisoners who did not confess, and that is correct. Initially, they did not acknowledge their wrongdoings, or they did not confess. And sometimes prisoners would confess upon the deployment of a cold method, but others did not. So we had to resort to other method, or that they had to be tortured, or they had to be beaten, or that then we had to use a plastic bag to suffocate them so that they confessed. And I can also say that 100% of them that did not answer at the first go.
Donc une petite précision.
So let us clarify something regarding the time when you received instructions to use hot methods, that is, to have recourse to violence, when tricks and persuasion hadn't worked. Did you have to report to your superiors, notably to Tit and Chan, the stage in which your interrogations were? Did you need an order each time and for each prisoner before having recourse to violence?
Before I use violent act on prisoners, I had to seek authorization from my group chief, whether torture could be used on that particular prisoner, because, for example, I had spent 3 or 4 days and the particular prisoner had not confessed. Then he would seek further authorization from Tat Chan or Tat Duch before I could use the violent act.
Est-ce que chaque interrogateur avait le droit?
Was each interrogator entitled to develop their own techniques resorting to violence, insofar as it didn't lead to the death of the prisoner?
We only had authority for small acts, for example, to pull hair from their leg. But for more serious acts, permission had to be sought.
Bon, pour que ce soit clair, je vais...
Very well. In order to understand you clearly, let me read what you said in E3/79, and the page in French is 00164585. In English, 00161553 up to 54, and in Khmer 00146594 and 95. And the question put to you was as follows. Free translation. As for the tools or techniques used, was it the same for everyone in the case of all interrogators, or each interrogator used whichever methods or materials they wanted, or it was Deutsch who ordered them to use them? This is a poor translation dating back to 2009, and your answer was as follows. The instruments used for torture were not ordered. We were not instructed to use one tool or the other. It was up to us, the interrogators, to choose ourselves with whatever means we had at our disposal, such as electric wires, pliers to remove nails, needles to stick under the nails. In a word, anything that we were able to find on the spot, end of quote. Free translation. Witness, do you confirm that you had at your disposal instruments that you could use to resort to violence as you wished?
បាទ
As for torture, a plier was used to pull a finger, or sometimes a nail is inserted under the fingernail. So the method was previously employed by the Chan, but later on we modified the method a little bit. So once a prisoner was inflicted upon with those torturing instruments, they usually confessed. But sometimes we had to modify the method a little bit in order for the prisoner to confess. For example, we use a nails to pinch or to insert under the fingernail, and when it became swollen, the prisoner, it was painful for the prisoner, and he confessed.
Monsieur le témoin, une question.
Witness, I have a rather personal question for you. How did you feel when you received orders to carry out these acts of torture in order to extort confessions from the prisoners? How could you afford to be insensitive in the face of such a situation and carry on doing your work?
Are you referring to my feeling while I am working at the present time, or my feeling at that time?
Des sentiments que vous éprouviez.
I'm referring to the feelings you had at the time. How could you afford to cope with such a situation in which you had to torture people in order to extort confessions from them? How could you have afforded to do that in human terms?
Witness, please hold on, and Counsel Coppert, you have the floor.
I'm not sure why the question is relevant. Why are the feelings of the witness during these acts, why are they relevant for any question that the chamber has to answer? I'm sure the witness didn't like doing it, but if he did or he didn't, it doesn't really add anything to legal and factual questions that the chamber has to answer.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I think it is relevant because in the context at the time it was part of a system and I would like to know how this witness faced such a situation, how he experienced it. And we should bear in mind that the superiors said that they had to, how did the superiors tell them to view the people that they were going to torture? That is the thrust of my question.
Maybe not a very relevant response. Mr. President, we have a presidential candidate in the United States who propagates waterboarding right now. I mean, we all have our opinions about that, but I know it's out of context, I agree, but what's the feelings of this witness in relation to those acts contribute to the truth?
President, the objection or the observation, that is what I heard through the Khmer interpretation, is overruled. This question is permissible since it's related to his functioning during the time that he worked at S21 Security Center. And Mr. Witness, you can respond to that question if you recall it. Witness. At that time, when they set us a plan and that we could use torture, I myself feel scared. Sometimes my body trembled during the daytime and sometimes during the nighttime. I was thinking about it, about whether torture shall be implemented. On one hand, I hate to fulfill the order. On the other hand, I did not want to engage in such an act of torture or violence, that it is our tradition that we did not resort to such violence. So this was the feeling that I had at the time. And at night time I was thinking of how I could survive tomorrow. Even at present time, when I think of what happened at the time, my body still trembles because of the constant fear in my feeling. I used to fight at the front battlefield, but I never feel scared as I was so scared at S21. At S21 I could never sleep well at night time, and only after the 7th January day I felt better. But even at present time, when I think of what happened at the time, my chest is pounding.
Je suis désolé de devoir vous poser.
I apologize for having to put other questions to you regarding what happened back then. When Doik and your superiors were speaking about prisoners, did they use the word prisoner or did they use the word enemy?
Generally, they were referred to as enemy and not prisoners. But for me, the term enemy has a more severe connotation than prisoners.
Est-ce que les
Did the enemies at S21 have the slightest chance of being released one day after having confessed what they were asked to confess?
From the time I started working at S21, I never saw any prisoner who confessed and was subsequently released.
So the enemies would enter S21 on the basis of an arrest decision. And did Duke ever tell you that it was possible that Ankar might have made a mistake by arresting some people?
I never heard the word making mistake in arresting the prisoners. They never use that.
En conséquence, est-ce qu'il
Therefore, was it possible for you to tell your superiors that the enemy or the prisoners you were interrogating was innocent after having interrogated this prisoner?
I object to this question. Mr. President, it has its own conclusion in it. Prosecution has been leading all along. There is ample evidence that prisoners who were detained at S21 were released. We discussed this earlier. About 150 prisoners from Division 703 were released. There's evidence from the chief photographer saying that people were
Sorry,
sent.
Counsel, you're testifying again. What's the ground for the objection? You can make these statements when it's your turn. You always, not always, but occasionally you get up, start testifying, and object on the basis that your opinion is different from what the witness might say.
Well, the prosecution is framing its questions in such a way. For instance, did the prisoner have the slightest chance of being released? And then he builds in his own conclusion. So he just framing the questions in such a way, leading the witness to exactly where he wants to go, whereas there's plenty of evidence, and that was the point that I'm trying to make, suggesting that a substantial number of prisoners were released or sent to Prey-Sar.
He asked an open question.
Thank you. I'm going to put that question again to the witness, and I will take advantage of this, that we don't agree with the finding that people had been released from S21 and sent to Prey-Sar. So, witness, was it possible after a prisoner was interrogated for you to believe that a prisoner or an enemy was innocent? And was it possible for you to relay that information to your superiors?
When I reported to my superior, I told him that I did not lead the prisoner to answer. I simply told my superior that the prisoner did not answer the interrogation yet. I did not seek permission for the release, President. I would like to inform parties that the word perpetration is rather the word guilt. Based on the observation of Cambodians, ordinary Cambodian people, they are not much aware of the meaning of the word guilt. I do not hear the translation in French language. Jack Malavan, do you hear the translation in French language?
Ce n'est pas grave, j'ai cru.
That's not a problem. I believe I understood that the Cambodians don't understand the full meaning of the word guilt or innocence. Well, now I'd like to turn to something else. During the training sessions with Doik, as
President, the word guilt is a legal term that has very deep meaning. Even students who are currently studying law, they are not well aware of the meaning of that word. I encourage parties to use the words that are well understood by other party so that in answering the question will be easy and it will contribute to the ascertaining of the truth when parties understand the meaning of the terms.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President. Witness, during the training sessions with Duik and your other superiors, did they ever tell you that you should feel no feelings or no pity for the enemies you were interrogating? Were you told that kind of thing?
When I studied, they told us not to feel pity for the enemy. Even our parents, we must also treat them in the same way if they are considered as enemy. We have to be absolute. We have to have firm position. We have to be loyal to the party. President, it is now convenient time for the break. The chamber will take a break from now until 3 o'clock. Court officer, please assist the witness at the waiting room reserved for the witness. And please bring him back along with his duty counsel into the courtroom at 3 o'clock. The court is now in recess.
ជើញក្រោកឈរ